It started not too long ago, the night I came out of St. Joseph's Abbey dressed as one of the groomsmen, and not as a groomsman. That day, the sun had not shown itself and the rain had been threatening to fall. The night was just as gloomy, moonless and starless, or so it seemed to me. My sister made note of how the yellow lights of the lamps outside the abbey glistened prettily and happily against the crystal earrings the bride wore. But I saw no such glistening, though I do remember the racket of sounds of children playing, women laughing, and the men shouting congratulations in the procession that followed the newlywed. And the music. The music I remember the most because it was getting on my nerves. Off they went, and I pictured the day I met both of them, cramped in a line to see a show. I was alone and they were together, but they still made conversation. We were all surprised to see we were assigned seats next to each other. What did I think of her then? I can't know, but I can guess based on what I think of her now. The one thing that is clear is that I felt strongly. The other groomsmen started walking to the pub we had selected for the after-party drinks, and I told them I would catch up, though I had no intentions of doing so. As I walked the streets back to my apartment, it happened for the first time. That first face, I could not tell the gender, probable age, or even skin color. It was a dark, amorphous shadow that emerged from a brick wall on the other side of the street, vivid and three-dimensional. Its eyeless face gave me nightmares that night, and I heard its silent screams in my dreams. It stayed with me in a way that few other things have, though it was only there for a little more than a second. The second time was in the following night. Most times, I sleep on my side, facing the window on the right wall of my bedroom. But that night, I felt like something watched me. Shivers went down my spine, and I turned in a frightened reflex. I saw a face coming out of the ceiling above me, staring like a blurred photograph. I still could not distinguish features, but its long hair hung from the head, moving softly with a breeze that came in through my opened window. I stared at it, and it stared back for several minutes. During that time, all of my muscles were tense. I seemed to lose my voice, and in the many times I opened my mouth to try to scream, nothing came out. Each time I did, the face also opened its mouth, mirroring my dumbfounded movements. And then, just like that, it was gone. The third time, I did not see them, but I heard them. Their voices came from my bedroom. They spoke while I was washing dishes after work, and would stop every time I turned off the faucet to discern what they were saying. I slept on the couch that night, every other night that week. August 18th, 2018. We were all sitting around the groom's laptop as we looked at their honeymoon pictures. The couple told funny stories, and the people who had been groomsmen and bridesmaids laughed. Their happiness was intoxicating, in the sense that it made me numb and dizzy. When they showed a picture of the bride topless at the beach by accident, I crumbled inside. Resentment filled me. I returned home drunk and senseless. So much that I had somehow forgotten my own misery, and was even slightly happy. But that night, those faces, they spoke again. Their voices came from under my bed. The first phrases I did not understand, as I was still waking. Their tones were sibilant, like a conspirator's whispers. And then I made out, "Would you just please tell me Tell you what? I asked, my voice shaking. And again, the damn things had decided to be silent. I wondered what to do for what seemed like hours. That, in reality, were certainly just minutes. I pictured that bodies were beneath my bed, buried under it. I wondered whether, every night, I rested on top of a grave. When my hands instinctively reached behind me, looking for a gravestone, I began to picture hands of a shadow coming to pull my blankets and eventually my own skin until I was bare. I imagined an enormous skull floating down from the ceiling, the jaw open to bite me, to swallow me. Still, I stepped out of bed, expecting to see rotting arms reaching to grab my ankles. But I saw no such thing. Then I got to the floor to look into the darkness, expecting to see the horrors of creation. But I saw no such thing. I only saw 2 pairs of eyes glowing among shadow, wide and huge. I could not speak until one of the faces spoke. "Why are you staring at me like that?" October 15th, 2018. After they spoke to me for the first time, they awoke nightmares in me, nightmares of a likeness that I had never experienced before. I saw many things every night. I saw dark corridors leading to black tunnels. I saw toolboxes, plastic bags, towels. I saw living rooms and basements with furniture all broken and astray. They were all still, all simple, but that somehow still evoked such a sense of dread that it even made me wake from the severity of my shivers. I did not see the faces in these dreams, but I knew that they were there, right behind me at all times, always looking, always staring at the back of my neck. And then it happened, slowly and gradually, but it happened. I became numb to it all. I became used to being stared at, and I became used to the dreadful stillness of my nightmares. They began to allure me into their concepts and images, to entice my feelings, until they gradually turned into irresistible and visceral fantasies. Each night, I went a little farther, one step at a time. I walked the tunnels and corridors. I broke one piece of furniture at a time. I used one tool at a time and cleaned the resulting mess with one towel at a time. I think the one time I went the farthest was when I realized the faces also had bodies. They had bodies all along. I just had not realized until that moment. My realization did not happen in a dream, though. It happened in a real basement at the end of a dark corridor while I held real tools. A drill and a hammer, to be specific. The bride stared at me, tied to a chair that was about to be broken. "Would you please just tell me?" she asked between sobs. "Why are you doing this?" I turned my own face from the tortured, bloody body of the groom that laid on the floor. I think at that point, he was still alive. I wondered how many towels that mess would take. Then I looked at the bride with my own set of huge, widened eyes. "Why are you staring at me like that?" she asked. No crimes, I thought as I turned on the drill and heard her screams of desperation. Just fantasies. Fantasies as visceral as her screams. Jonah Harvester was the golden-haired, angel-faced picture of innocence that every parent envisioned their little boy as. He had a cherub's wry smile and a natural charisma to him that was impossible to deny. You just couldn't say no to that little face, and no one really ever did. Simply put, Jonah was a spoiled brat. His parents never learned how to deny their perfect angel any luxury, no matter how trivial. The only people who ever said no to him quickly learned that you literally couldn't say no, or else you'd face one of his screaming tantrums. And God help you then. I never really liked Jonah, but he was still technically my friend. In hindsight, I think part of me had hoped he'd mature as we got older, but he never did. By the time we were around 10, Jonah was no less of a brat. The biggest difference was he knew it and he reveled in it. With a new kid brother on the way, my family needed a bigger house. The move was pretty standard. The new house was old but nice. Ultimately, I think Jonah was even more psyched for this than I was. The notion of getting to run around and play in the countless unexplored rooms of that large old house was irresistible to him, and he acted like it was all a gift for him. The day we moved in, Jonah came knocking on my door, wearing the same cocky smirk you'd see on a DreamWorks movie poster. "Hey, are you guys moved in yet?" he asked. The truck was still out front, and my parents were still unloading it. "Jonah!" My dad approached behind him, cheerful as ever, and Jonah fed off that, tipping him his always charming smile. "Hey, Mr. Hart, can Gary come play?" Of course he couldn't say no. Maybe I should have been thankful for that. It spared me of the hassle of having to help with the move for a few hours, and Jonah got to explore just like he wanted. He ran from room to room, trying to think up new games until he got bored, which he inevitably did. I won't pretend I didn't enjoy myself. I did. I had fun. But when the day was done, I still enjoyed myself. The house was just as big as Jonah had envisioned. He stood at the top of the winding grand staircase and looked out over the front hall. "Geez, look it," he said under his breath. "This place is so big, it's like from a movie or something." He looked at the ornate chandelier that hung a short distance from the top of the stairs. "Do you think I could hang from it?" he asked with a grin. "I'll bet if I jump I could grab it." "Maybe?" I asked. "I don't think you should though. What if you fall?" "I won't fall," he assured me, already committed to doing it. I saw him start to climb the railing and grabbed him by the shoulders to stop him. "Don't," I warned. "You'll get hurt." Jonah shot me a bitter glare. "Don't stop me or I'll hit you," he said before trying to climb again. "Jonah!" My dad's voice interrupted him. "Careful up there. Don't fall and break your arm." "I won't," he said, offering his usual angelic grin. "I just wanted to see if I could hang from the chandelier." The utter stupidity of that statement baffled my poor father, and it left a look on his face I won't soon forget. "Don't try it," was all he managed to say, still a little stupefied. "You'll break your neck. Look, you two should go play outside." For a moment, I was afraid that this would kickstart one of Jonah's famous tantrums. I could see him weighing the pros and cons, but in the end, he chose not to. What he did instead was go outside with me for all of 10 minutes, and then go back to being a hooligan. Pretty par for the course, but at least he let the chandelier issue go. At the end of the day, when all was said and done, Jonah went home and I went to sleep in my new bedroom. I was tired from the day, and honestly, I did need the rest. Unfortunately for me, it was one of those nights where my head hit the pillow and my mind was suddenly wide awake. I lay in bed, wishing I could get out and play with my Game Boy. But it was the weekend and moving hadn't exempted me from school. My parents had a pretty strict no Game Boy in bed rule, and I was too young to ever imagine breaking it. I'm sure I managed to doze off a little bit. I'm pretty sure I got some sleep. I had to have. I remember being surprised when I caught a floral scent and heard footsteps in my bedroom. I shifted a little before opening my eyes, half expecting to see my parents there. What I saw instead was a pale figure of a woman. She looked like no one I'd ever seen before. She wore a long, pale dress, and her hair hung loosely around her shoulders. In one hand she held a candle, and the look on her face was one of concern. "Are you there?" she asked, looking around. I didn't answer. I didn't know if I could. I just sat there and stared silently at the figure of a woman as she stood in the darkness of my room. "Are you there?" she called again. It was at this time that I caught the accent in her voice, Irish. She sounded young and afraid. I opened my mouth to speak, but, well, I just couldn't manage it. Her candle flickered and went out, and with it, she vanished into the darkness. I fumbled around to turn on my lamp, but when I did, all I found was my empty room. No Irish woman, just me. "No way, you mean like a ghost?" Jonah asked with wide eyes when I told him at school the next day. "Get real, there's no such thing as ghosts." "I know what I saw," I said. "She was right there in my bedroom. She disappeared when I turned on the light." He chuckled and pushed me slightly. "You're a liar," he said, and quickly decided to move on to something else. I should have known he wouldn't believe me, so I didn't tell anyone else. And Jonah seemed to forget about it pretty quickly and decided to focus on going to the teacher to have a screaming tantrum about some other boys, not including him in their game of tag, that he'd have a screaming tantrum if they caught him and made him it when he didn't want to be it. As the day went on, the ghost woman quickly fell into the back of my mind. I wondered if maybe it had been a dream. That night, when I was sent to bed, I figured it wasn't going to happen again, and I slept so peacefully. Still, she came. I woke up hearing her footsteps again, and watching as she crossed the foot of my bed, illuminated by her candle. "Are you there?" she asked, voice desperate and nervous. I watched her in silence. I turned on the light before she could ask again, and this time, she didn't disappear. "Are you there?" she asked again. In the light, I could see her clearly. There was no ethereal glow to her, no sign that she was anything but a normal human. Her candle flickered and went out. In the blink of an eye, she was gone all over again. I had to tell Jonah. At recess, as we walked out onto the playground, I debated if I really should or not. Of course, I cracked in the end. "I saw the ghost again," I said as we stepped outside, and Jonah looked over at me, eyebrows quirked. "Seriously?" he asked, his tone suggesting he didn't believe me. "Yes, seriously," I said. "She comes every night." "Oh, at 3 a.m., right?" he teased. "Seriously, I'm not going to fall for it." "I'll show you," I said. "I'll bet if you stayed over tonight, you'll see her too." That seemed to pique his interest. Jonah stared at me for a few moments before deciding he had nothing to lose. "All right," he said softly. "Maybe I will then. I'll talk to my mom and see you tonight." He might as well have just said yes. We both know she'd never refuse him. And sure enough, she didn't. That night, Jonah and I shared a bed. He sat there in his Spider-Man pajamas, as alert as ever. I was getting tired from the day, but I had something to prove. For hours we sat there, whispering to each other and reading scary stories. I could tell from his ever-flippant demeanor. Jonah was still convinced that all of this was a lie. Then, we heard footsteps. The color drained from his face. We sat in silence, listening as the footsteps drew closer. Then we saw the woman emerge through my bedroom door. She moved her arms like she was opening it, but the door remained shut. The candle in her hand flickered gently as it cast its orange glow through the room. "Are you there?" The same words she'd always spoken. She walked across the foot of my bed, looking around just as she had the other 2 nights. "Are you there?" she asked again. Jonah watched her in amazement, but his amazement was not silent. "I'm here," he said, and I tried to force him down onto the bed and clamp my hands over his mouth. He fought me off easily enough. The ghost was staring down at us now, a soft smile on her face. "Good," she said. "I'm so glad you've made it. Is it done?" "Yes," Jonah said, and this time I didn't stop him. This was different from what I'd seen before. The ghost let out a sigh of relief. "Finally." She took a step forward, phasing through my bed. "I've missed you so much." "Did you hear that?" Her voice was low now, worried. She pulled away. No. If they know, they'll never let us be together," she said softly, and for a moment there was silence. "Yes," she finally said. "You're right. There's no other way. It has to be done." She looked towards Jonah and I once more. I thought I saw fear in her eyes. There was a moment of hesitation before she headed for the door again. Jonah got out of bed, following to see what she would do next. We watched as she made her way down the hall and towards the stairs. She stood at the banister, looking down the front hall. "Bastards," she said softly and looked back towards us. "They'll not come between us. Together now. Come." She held out a hand, but neither of us moved. We didn't need to. She climbed over the railing, balancing herself on the edge of the floor. "Come on," she beckoned. "Just one step, and we'll be beyond them forever." Jonah took a step forward towards her, and I was too afraid to stop him. He reached out a hand towards the woman, but before he could touch her, she fell backwards. She didn't scream, she just vanished. I let out a startled cry and ran past Jonah to stare down onto the landing. I'd hoped there would be nothing there, but I was wrong. The ghost of the woman lay on the ground below, broken and dead. Jonah appeared beside me, staring down at her corpse in horror, before, just like before, she slowly faded away. We couldn't look away. Now we could only stare at where she'd been. "Oh my God," Jonah said softly, clearly shaken. That was real." "I know," was the only reply I had. At school the next day, Jonah couldn't stop talking to me about it. I really didn't want him to. This was huge. He had every right to be excited about it. "We need to find out who she was," he said. "I mean, what if she's rich or something? Maybe there's a treasure, or we could find a way to prove it. We've got proof of ghosts now, right?" I'll never forget the raw elation in his voice. I gotta stay over again, he said. I've gotta see it again. I don't know. I mean, that might not be a good idea, I said a little nervously. What if she remembers us or something? What if she thinks we killed her? She killed herself, Jonah argued. Come on, let me stay over. His tone implied a tantrum if I didn't say yes. We can see if she does anything else, he added, ever hopeful. I sighed. All right, yeah, why not? Yes! Jonah grinned, ear to ear. This is gonna be so cool. That night played out almost the same as the one before. Jonah and I had stayed up reading scary stories. But this time, his excitement was palpable. He was eager for the arrival of our ghost. He had a camera to document the proof. He was ready for action. As for me, I didn't know what to expect. When we heard the footsteps, Jonah and I got quiet. Our ghost approached, slowly, like she always did. The footsteps grew closer and closer. Finally, we saw her at the door, going through the motions of opening it, and walking towards the bed, looking around. Are you there? She asked. Jonah grinned. Yes, he replied, and the ghost looked at him. Her eyes were cold and lifeless. You lied, she said. Jonah's smile faded, and from the ghost came one of the most horrific shrieks I've ever heard in my life. She lunged for him, hands outstretched. In my panic, I scrambled off the bed and left Jonah to his fate. The ghost overcame him and forced him down on the bed. I must have been screaming because I could hear my parents rushing down the hall to see what was the matter. They came in to find Jonah on the bed, his body jerking and convulsing violently. My dad tried helplessly to restrain him while my mother called 911. I saw no trace of the ghost. She'd vanished in the commotion. The hospital would later say that Jonah had suffered an epileptic seizure. He was out of school for the rest of the week. I didn't tell the doctors or his parents about the ghost. With no proof, I knew they'd never believe it. I was afraid to sleep in my room that night, and so I was allowed to sleep on the couch. Not that I really did sleep. No, I stayed up and listened for her footsteps. I crept upstairs to watch my bedroom to see if the ghost would return. But she didn't. In fact, I never saw her again. As the weekend came around, most of her things were unpacked, and my room was starting to look like what I wanted it to look like. It wasn't perfect, but it was passable. It was Saturday, and I was lazing around the house, enjoying the morning run of cartoons, when I heard a knock on the window behind me. I looked back to see Jonah's smiling face. I wasn't sure if he'd seen me. He didn't seem to have noticed me yet. I almost got up to answer the door when I heard his voice. "Gary?" he called. "Are you there?" The blood in my veins turned ice cold. Jonah had never had an Irish accent before. So, I've been told that my experience should be posted here, because apparently it sounds too insane to be real. Before I start, I used to work for Black Angus in Southwest Portland, Oregon. I didn't work there long though, just about 7 months. I was hired for a janitor position, but later got an extra position as a graveyard dishwasher. which made my schedule noon to 3 p.m., then 5 p.m. to closing, which was between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m., depending on how quickly we got the place cleaned up before fully closing. This, though, is about when closing took a lot longer than normal. We ended up closing at 3 a.m. I asked for a ride from my manager because I wouldn't be able to take the bus home. But unfortunately, he couldn't because he didn't have the money to cover the gas. So, lucky me, I had to walk home. Thankfully, I didn't have to work for the next few days. But still, the walk home was exhausting. Anyways, it was maybe 3:40, 3:50 a.m., and I was nearing the bus station. I saw a bus parked there, and I thought it wasn't available. So like an idiot, I didn't bother to rush and see. And just as I was getting to the station, that's when it takes off. I started yelling to get the driver's attention, but no luck. I spent the next hour cursing at myself for that. So I continue on. Around 4:30 a.m., I'm halfway home. I decide to take a break from walking and sit down on the corner of a neighborhood block under a street spotlight and have a cigarette. Not long after I light up, I hear just a few feet from me, "Got another one?" Now, I'm pretty damn good at hearing when it's the dead of night and it's super quiet. So for me, it's like this guy just appeared. So I basically jumped up like someone intentionally tried to scare me, which, if it was intentional, it definitely worked. Apparently, I scared the guy too, because he was like, "Whoa, sorry, didn't mean to scare you. Just wondering if you have an extra smoke." And while it took me a minute to calm down, I eventually responded, "Yeah, sure, where the hell did you come from?" He tells me he was sitting there before I arrived. I tell him about my long walk from work and whatever, and he gives a logical reason. Maybe you were so tired from that walk that you just didn't notice me. And I figured that was a good enough reason. I was exhausted after all, so anything's possible. We ended up talking for a while, a bunch of random stuff. I ended up sharing more than I intended. Eventually, I felt rested enough, and I told him that I was going to continue my walk home. He asked which way I'm heading, and since I didn't care, I told him. He then decided to tag along with me. We walked till maybe 5 a.m., and we're going to head our separate ways. And personally, the guy felt like a good guy, and I asked him if he wanted to maybe hook up later. As we began to trade numbers, I started to hear some crying sounds. Hearing the crying made me pause, and I asked, "Did you hear that?" And he nods. At first, I figured it wasn't our business, but he suggested, "Maybe we should go check it out. What if someone's in need?" I agreed, and we went looking for where it was coming from. As we got closer, the crying became louder, and we saw her. This woman rocking side to side as she walked forward, seemingly aimlessly, like she was drunk. I said, "I'm betting she's drunk and she just needs to walk it off." And he says, "I don't know if we can know for sure without checking." And she disappears behind a building. Without saying a word, he rushes off towards her. I wish I had ignored it when I first heard it. I followed. I didn't rush. I simply walked. So obviously he got there before I did. He then gestures to hurry up. So I run. When I got there, he points, and she's down a ways, but sitting against the wall, still crying. I then say, "She's probably gonna pass out." And then we hear her say, "My baby," as she cries. At this point, he says, "Shit. Now we've got to make sure. Wait here in case a cop comes by. She might need their help," and jogs towards her. From the moment I heard the crying, I swear I wasn't feeling right, as if deep down I knew something was wrong. And as he got closer, that feeling just intensified. He pulled out his phone and shined his light on her. I couldn't hear him from this distance, but I could tell he was talking to her. But she just kept crying and repeating, "My baby." He then lifts her up, and standing her there, she shoves his arms off and continues to cry, "My baby." I then yell, "So is she all right?" And he yells back, 911, there's blood on her clothes." This just became real. I opened my phone, but I only have a few bars. I didn't know at the time that it didn't matter how many I had, 911 would work regardless. So I decided to try to get better signal. A short bit later, I have enough and call them up. I tell them that we found a woman who needs help, and I was about to tell them the location, and then I hear screaming. My voice just stops, 'cause it's not her, it's him. And I run as fast as I can back to the alley. And this is why I was told it sounded too insane to be real. I swear, I'm not making this up. I'm panicking right now, even though it was years ago. I wish I had tried harder to convince him. What I saw made me piss my pants. I saw him on the ground, against a wall. She was there, yelling frantically over and over, "My baby, my baby, my baby." And her stomach. There were tentacles coming out of her, grabbing him. I was frozen in utter terror, and they pulled him into her stomach, and his screams stopped. I could see her caressing her stomach, saying more softly, "My baby." And then I hear, "Sir, are you still there?" And she looks in my direction. At that point, I take off running. I wasn't thinking about it, but when I got far enough away, I realized I'd dropped my phone. After what I saw, there was no way I was going back. I continued to run the rest of the way home, looking back, and each time making sure there was nothing behind me. I finally get home, and I am drenching in sweat. I get in my apartment, and my cousin scares me half to death. Finally, after nearly falling back, I rush up to him and tell him I need to use his phone because I lost mine. He hands it over and asks, "Who are you calling?" I tell him the cops, and I head outside as he yells, "What the hell for?" But I don't respond and just call them. I tell them exactly what happened, where it happened, and that I had called them earlier. Luckily, it's the same person that answered the first time. They heard screaming, and since I didn't respond, they had already sent officers out by tracking my phone. I asked if they'd found anything, but the officers were just arriving and said if I gave them my address, they'd contact me later. So I gave them my address and asked when I should expect to hear back from them. The dispatcher told me she wouldn't be able to give an exact time, but said to stay home. I went back inside, gave my cousin back his phone, and again he asks, "So why did you need to call the cops?" And I tell him that I witnessed a murder. I didn't give him the full details because I was still shaking from the experience. I then opted to pass out because I was beyond exhausted. I had no idea what time it was or how long I had slept, but I was woken up by my cousin, and he says, "Hey, cops are here," and I stumble out of my bed to the living room. There are 2 cops waiting for me. I'm so tired that I say, "Hi," in a groggy tone, and ask what they found. They ask me, "Were you intoxicated when you called?" I give them a look like I'm being accused of something and say, "No, I wasn't drinking. I was exhausted and on my way home." And I told them the rest. They tell me there was nothing at the scene besides my phone. I ask about the dispatcher because she heard the screams, and it certainly wasn't me. But they didn't believe me. Apparently, there wasn't anything to suggest a murder had taken place, and later they kept probing me to see if I was under the influence of something, or just trying to get attention. I swore up and down what I saw was real, and I saw someone die. Then they say, maybe it's because you were so exhausted, you hallucinated the whole thing. And I just gave up. Eventually, they hand me my phone. Then I remember that guy I had met had given me his phone number, and I told them to check the number. But it didn't matter. They wouldn't listen. To them, I was either high on something, imagining it, or trying to get attention. I have since never gone back to that location where we first found the thing. Right now, I don't even live in that same state anymore, but I'm still haunted by the screaming and the repeated words, "My baby." If you ever hear crying and later hear, "My baby," just run. Seriously, just run. The digital clock on the nightstand next to my bed was blinking 12:04 a.m. when it first happened. I woke up surrounded by darkness, drowning in panic. Rational thought had left my brain, and instinct was in command. My only reaction was gasping for air as if I were drowning, and trying to guess what was making the loud rattle against my bedroom window. My heart had leapt up into my throat, suffocating me in black fear. My eyes were still adjusting to the darkness. The only light in the room was a small, garish crimson to the left of me. 4 minutes after midnight. It was non-stop, hurting my eyes. Numerous possibilities of what that noise could be ran through my head. Countless people could have been at the window, but 2 ideas flared up above all others. The first, the echoing rattle was a hallucination, something from a dream. Waking up during a dream wasn't strange. But the other idea, it was the only thing in my head when there was another booming rattle. Someone was out there, but who? Who would bang on someone's window? Who would do this unannounced at midnight? Not a friend, not family. An unknown person was outside, knowing where I lived, trying to get inside, wanting to make me come out. I never owned a gun. Nothing about my area ever gave off the vibe of being unsafe. It was a community where you could leave your doors unlocked. The neighbors I made friends with did that, but not me. I was the odd man out who kept his doors locked. Pulling myself out of bed, I walked noiselessly towards the living room. My eyes had adjusted, and there was a whole kitchen of things I could use to defend myself. The living room was next to the kitchen, and I noticed the bed set up there was empty. Once the living room light was on, everything came together. A set of keys lay on the messy bedsheets. The anxiety was washed away, and I opened the sliding glass back door adjacent to my bedroom. My roommate immediately came inside. He said, "Sorry, I just came back from the show and I forgot my keys." "It's fine," I replied. "You spooked the hell out of me, though." That wasn't a lie, and having anxiety disorder didn't help. An affliction like that was common, but it was one that could warp your reality if you weren't careful enough to handle it. It even set off psychotic symptoms in more extreme cases. I had to remind him to try not to scare me, but I never held it against him. My roommate didn't mean it, and he was never hard to reason with, but living with another person still had challenges sometimes. Even if it was just one person, and a person I was friends with. He smiled and told me, "All right, that's fine. Won't happen again. Promise. I'll keep my keys clipped around one of my belt loops from now on." Sounds good. My heart was still slowing down when I went back to bed, but I was confident. I mean, my roommate was the type of guy to keep his word. And I slept at peace for a few weeks after that. It was enough to forget that little scare happened. But lately, I had to stay at work until midnight when I'd normally finish by 8. Driving back home alone was an exhausting task. I was awoken in a pool of black again. Blaring in my face was the clock. Again and again, it flashed 12:02 a.m. Like the first time I woke up, gasping for air, to the same horrific rattle. Each time felt like its own form of drowning. The sheet of white-hot panic was more intense, but it didn't last long. I got up, realizing it was my roommate. He made his promise, but everyone forgot things, and it wasn't a big deal. Walking out to the living room, a worse sound crept up to me. It was snoring. When I was in the living room, there was my roommate, fast asleep. I looked to the sliding door. It was covered by a thick, black curtain. The moonlight was peering in, watching the both of us. The curtain's shadow was cast against it. That, and something else. I couldn't tell what it was. I lightly swatted the curtain. Only some of the shadow moved. The rest stayed in its place for a second, then it vanished. Hurrying to the kitchen, I pulled open one of the drawers and found a steak knife. I felt crazy. It was textbook paranoia. But I figured the whole noise would go away. Taking the knife with me and putting it under the mattress was just a way to feel safe. When I lay back down again, the rattle against the window came like clockwork. It couldn't have been anything my imagination conjured up. It had to have been an animal. Stray cats and dogs weren't too common, but there were enough around to know about them. Curiosity got the better of me. I took the knife and approached the window. Pulling away the curtains was my greatest mistake. Staring at me was a pair of tiny, beady, gray eyes sitting in hollow sockets. The face was concealed, but around it, the skin was yellowed, loose, and peeling. Its body was a solid 7 feet tall, hunched over and lanky. Little bunches of stringy strands of grime-covered hair dangled over its head. The face was covered with a white, blank face mask. The right half of it burned and shriveled. Without taking its eyes off me, the figure put its oversized fingers against the window. Many things come out past midnight, various animals and humans alike. But what I'm referring to specifically, though, things that should not exist. Terrifying creatures beyond the comprehension of the most wicked of imaginations. Have you ever been out past midnight? If so, surely you felt that odd feeling as if you're being watched when you're alone. When you're alone is when you are most vulnerable to them. You see, they don't like to hunt groups of people. It's much easier when the victims are isolated. This is why you probably won't see anything odd when you're out with friends this late. Why would I know this, you ask? Well, I had my own experience many years ago. This experience shook me to my core. What happened made me reevaluate everything I thought was our reality. It made me believe myself to be mentally unsound. My Thanksgiving break had just started, and my plans were to spend the first few days at my friend Tyler's house. This was all back in high school, so I had no means of transportation besides my parents. Originally, they were supposed to take me over there, but they decided to take a little surprise vacation on their own. I got a text midway through the day from my mom saying that she was unable to give me a ride, and since my dad was going off with her, he couldn't either. This left me two options. I either walk over to Tyler's or I simply don't go. Initially, I went with the latter. Me and Tyler played Xbox for a few hours. I was a pretty lazy kid, cursing and killing each other in both private and online matches in Call of Duty. Before I knew it, clock had already struck 11. I made a mention of this to Tyler, saying I should probably get off and do some of my homework as assigned over break. Tyler then threw some insults at me, saying that I should walk over, that I was a wuss, etc. Typical shit talking between two 15-year-old boys. Somehow, Tyler eventually convinced me to just say screw it and walk. It was a 2.5-mile walk, so I figured I'd be done in roughly an hour. I packed up all my stuff, told Tyler I was on the way, and left. It was about 11:30. I should have never said yes to coming. Just thinking how I could explain these events is giving me feelings of dread. A little information first. I lived in a very poorly lit area. It was a small city called Norco, pretty much the literal ass crack of California. Most of the lights were in the inner city, and at the same time I lived in the outskirts. The light posts in my area were few and far between, and a lot of the land I had to traverse before making it to Tyler's was barren. It was the type of empty space that would give anyone walking on it late at night an eerie feeling. Just to add to this, despite the lack of light, I thought I was brave enough to go without a flashlight. I was a very naive kid, as you can tell. The first 20 minutes went by without issue. This is about the time it took me to get out of the populated area. Once I hit the more desolate area, I could tell something was off. I swore that literally a minute ago I could hear all the sounds of the night. Crickets chirping, wind blowing, all of that. However, it had come to an abrupt stop. This gave me a very unsettling feeling, so I checked the time to see how long it had been since I had left my house. It was 12 on the dot. This meant that I had about 20 to 30 minutes left of walking to do before I was at Tyler's house. The distance wasn't an issue for me, but the unnerving silence was. All I could hear at that point were my footsteps and my breathing. I'd never been in such a quiet setting before. It was almost as if the world froze around me. I kept walking for what felt like hours and decided to check my watch. It was 12. How? With the distance I thought I had covered, it shouldn't be the exact time as when I initially checked. As I was in the midst of trying to figure out if my watch broke, I heard a noise in the shrubbery to my right. This caused me to jump due to the prolonged silence I'd gotten used to. I was no longer the only one breathing. I heard a long, labored breath, something that sounded like it was coming from a dying animal. Now, I wasn't a veterinarian, and it was past midnight at this point. I wasn't going to go and check out where the noise came from. Horror movies had at least taught me some common sense. I quickly moved from the sidewalk on which I was walking, moving towards the center of the street instead. The creature I had heard from the shrubbery moved as well. It came out of the area in which it was hiding. All of my red flags had been raised. I was about ready to haul ass out of there. At this point, I was looking directly at it. When it stepped out into the dimly lit area, I could barely make out any features. Remember how I said the light posts were few and far between? Well, this was at the point of my journey in which the streets were scarcely lit, and details were somewhat visible. The first detail I noticed was the extremely elongated shadow that this thing cast on the ground. The creature must have been at least 8 feet tall. It looked human in overall appearance. Since it was standing with its back to the most recent lamppost, its face was too dark to make out specific features. Even with this as a factor, I could see that it was smiling. It wore a tattered up tan trench coat which went down to its waist, an unkempt vest, what seemed like shredded up dress pants, and torn up shoes. All of the clothing it had on was clearly too small for it. In the brief few seconds that I was staring back at this thing, a few events transpired. These events have haunted me well into my adult years. At first, I noticed its head was slowly tilting to the side, all while maintaining that same damn crooked smile. That same smile that makes my blood run cold whenever I think about it. For those asking why I didn't just book it at this point, try putting yourself in my shoes. I was a 15-year-old kid who had never experienced true fear at any point in his life. I truly did not know what to do. I was frozen. What happened next is kind of a blur. I recall hearing a horrifying mix of bones breaking as well as a blood-curdling, inhuman scream. I saw the creature get on all fours, positioning its arms and legs at impossible angles. It then started galloping towards me. The damned thing was charging me. It took me a minute to react to what was occurring. I finally hauled ass, something I should have done from the start. I glanced behind me to check the distance I had made from it, but it was moving at an extremely alarming pace. This was a pace faster than most animals on fours run. It was catching up, and quickly. I brainstormed and had the bright idea of tossing my duffel bag full of Xbox equipment, clothes, and toiletries directly at the creature. It had seemingly hit it in the head, buying me a decent amount of space from it. I kept sprinting until I saw a car's headlights turn the corner for the street I was on. I waved frantically, screaming as loud as I could for help. I heard the creature's bones making a sick, meaty noise while smacking the pavement. It was right behind me at this point, as I could feel its labored breaths on the hair on the back of my neck. My screams got louder and my waving more frantic until silence. The car was around 100 feet from me at that point. The creature had seemingly just disappeared altogether or run back into the shrubbery. I didn't care. I was alive, and that's all I was concerned about. I was crying, out of breath, and frankly, a complete mess. But who wouldn't be? The driver, clearly seeing my current physical state, pulled up next to me and asked if everything was all right and if there was anything he could do to help me. I was a big, blubbering mess, and I couldn't even form a complete sentence when responding to him. I thanked him profusely for coming when he did, but he clearly didn't understand why I was so thankful. I don't blame him. Who would? The events I wrote down here are truly bizarre, and I probably seem like a madman to you. I asked if he could drive me home, as I was just a few minutes' drive away, and he obliged. I almost forgot about my duffel bag due to all the hectic events that took place. As I got out of the car to retrieve it, I looked up the hill into the shrubbery. As I stared up that hill, I swear that I saw that crooked smile through the greenery staring down at me. After I made it home that night, I called my parents up and pleaded for them to come home, simply telling them that I was chased by a man who was attempting to rob me. I knew they wouldn't believe my story about the creature I saw. Shortly after the return, the cops came as well. They asked for a description of the individual who chased me. Not wanting to go into detail about the horrifying portions of that thing, I just told them that it was too dark to make out any distinguishing features. Apparently, they also interviewed the man who saved me, and he told them that I was running from nothing, just complete darkness. His testimony was among one of the reasons my parents coaxed me into therapy. That, and along with the fact that I wasn't near the same person I was before my parents left for their vacation. Eventually, everything went back to somewhat normal state, despite my traumatic experience. Needless to say, I never left my house past midnight again, unless of course I was in a car. Even in groups of friends, I still declined to go out without a solid means of transportation. The events that night have always stuck with me. It's been years, and late at night I still hear those sickening bone pops and inhuman screams as I'm trying to get some shut-eye. I moved around quite a bit since then, trying to get larger cities just to avoid the unnerving empty stretches, as well as the dim lighting that my old town used to provide. Now, no matter how far I move from where it happened, I can't seem to shake what occurred on that dark night over Thanksgiving break. No amount of medication, therapy sessions, or research into what the hell thing was has helped me much regarding the trauma of it all. It's almost as if now that I know creatures like that exist, reality seems like a stranger to me. How little we as humans seem to know about our little crevice of this universe terrifies me. I constantly wonder what else there is that we simply lack the means to perceive. All of this brings me to the main point of writing and sharing this all with you. Consider this a sort of warning for those of you who are night owls. Things are not what they seem when it's dark. Please be safe, share this with those you care about, and most of all, be wary of the creatures that come out past midnight. My friend asked me one day in October, "Hey Jesse, do you want to come to a bonfire at my house tonight?" I'd never been to a bonfire before, and I didn't have a ride to their house 2 miles away, but he insisted that his father could give me a ride. It was a very quiet drive, and he was acting a little shifty, but I didn't think anything of it. He had always been anxious and socially awkward. I didn't know his family well, but his father had never been much of a talker. "Is Mrs. Peterson going to be joining us? I heard she was." What I'd started to say was that she and Mr. Peterson were separated, and she was living in her mother's house, but based on the tension in Mr. Peterson's cheekbones, I cut my question short. "Nope, she's still at her mother's." I was quiet the rest of the trip, not wanting to crush any more eggshells underfoot. The truck's brakes squeaked as it parked in the gravel driveway. The house was just a few minutes away from the wilderness and deep pine forests of Oregon. Jacob led me to where the rest of the family was standing, to an enormous pile of wood in the backyard. "Whoa, looks like it's gonna be a big fire," I said anxiously. "How hot would this burn?" "They're always smaller than you'll think they'll be, but it'll do the job nicely." Jacob's father grinned. He seemed in a better mood. Jacob's 2 older sisters began throwing gasoline onto the wood, drenching it with highly flammable fumes. My tension rose, and I stepped a few steps away from the pile. This was looking like the forest may catch fire with this enormous blaze. Jacob, his sisters, and father stood back as well. Mr. Peterson lit a match. They all seemed strangely nervous and excited, but all I could feel was this tingling sensation of fear in my stomach and fingertips. "I've been looking forward to this," said Mr. Peterson slowly. The match flew from his fingers into the pile of wood. The pile erupted into an enormous fireball. A hungry, raging inferno devouring the offering of wood by these puny mortals. The heat was so intense I felt as if the skin on my face was shrinking onto my skull. Jacob asked me if I could sign off a merit badge for him, fire starting or something, and was particular that I put the date and time. "Well, Jesse, they can be pretty finicky at the office," he stuttered out. One of his sisters began throwing log after log onto the fire in a frenzy, cackling all the while. "Burn, burn, burn." At the last exclamation, she tossed one of the containers of gasoline straight into the fire, on the end closest to me. "Nicole, no!" Mr. Peterson yelled, but it was too late. The can exploded, sending a fireball in my direction. I fell backwards as I tried to run away, arms shielding my face from the greedy tendrils of flames. I got up and could see the force of the explosion had thrown several logs out of the pile. The sight that I saw in that fire will haunt me till my dying day. I saw a face upside down in the blaze. The woman's hair was aflame, and her eyes stared into my soul as her skin bubbled. It was Mrs. Peterson, buried beneath the wood, dead. The Petersons rose from their curled-up positions on the grass and looked towards me. They read the panic in my eyes and looked at the fire to see the horrifying sight. "No, no, no, no," screamed Mr. Peterson. I thought he was mourning his wife until he looked up with tearful eyes towards me. "You've seen too much, kid. You were supposed to be our witness that we were nowhere near that house fire." He wasn't making sense, but he was advancing on me, determined. Jacob and his sisters slowly moved to surround me. "I'm sorry for what I'm going to have to do to you, kid. We can't let you leave." My eyes shifted to all the faces in turn. They were all in on it. That told me all I needed to know. I hucked the remaining gas can at my feet, over my head and into the fire. And the fireball sent everyone cowering. Like the destructive outburst of an angry deity. I didn't flinch. I had to get out of here before they killed me. Their failed alibi. I pushed Jacob over as he staggered and booked it for the forest. I had no flashlight, but I had the will to live. I could hear noises over the rushing of the wind and rustling of the underbrush behind me. I'm going to kill you, you little snitch. It was pitch black now, but they didn't have flashlights either. Suddenly, a light shone behind me. Phone flashlight. Its weak beam lit up a decent-sized river with steep banks on either side ahead of me. I ran haphazardly down the bank and into the river up to my knees. "Where is he, Dad?" I heard from a few hundred feet away, out of sight above the bank. "Crossing the river. We've got to catch him before he gets to the road." I looked to my right and saw a corrugated metal tube of a culvert below the train tracks. I threw a large rock as far as I could in the direction the Petersons were running, and I heard, "Gotcha now," from 20 feet away. I dove into the large metal tube and laid back in the cramped space. It was big enough I didn't have to crawl, but I couldn't lay my back against the edge and hide. I pulled out my phone and began to dial 911 in the darkness. Splashes erupted in the river as Mr. Peterson crossed and kept running. Thank goodness I had thrown that rock. As I tensely waited in my hiding place, I heard the rest of the family crossing the river and gunshots. 911, what's your emergency? Words popped from my mouth like water. Peterson's, edge of town, big fire. They're chasing me and I need you to come help me. Sir, slow down, please. Jesse, okay, Jesse. Give it to me slow so I can send the police there. We'll also track the call and pinpoint your location while you talk. Jesse, where did you go? They were still searching for me and were still in the area. I gave the dispatch the whole story in a panicked whisper, not wanting to be found, and after an agonizing half hour, I heard sirens and rustling leaves around my hiding place. Drop the gun, now! I heard an unfamiliar voice shout, Jesse, come out, it's all right. I approached the house to see the whole family in custody, the fire put out. The paramedics on site immediately wrapped me in a blanket, which is when I noticed my shivering. I stared into the distance and spoke to the paramedic nearest me. They wanted to burn down Mrs. Peterson's mother's house and then plant her burnt remains in the house. The older man had no idea what I was talking about, but nodded silently to keep me talking. I was supposed to be their alibi. They had me sign some merit badge paper as evidence. I was here at this time, and therefore, if they were suspected, they could have evidence they were here. I collapsed and sobbed into the man's shoulder, and he seemed startled, but held me close as I processed it all, eyes squeezed closed. After several long minutes, I looked up to see the Petersons being pushed into police cars. Their eyes told me that I would pay someday. They were driven away. After the trial, I never saw the Peterson family again. My parents relocated to a different state for safety, or at least peace of mind. I now live on my own, far away from that bonfire, from those woods, from that family. I still look over my shoulder for familiar faces who wish me harm. I would tell you where I live, but you never know who may be reading. Better safe than sorry. Hello everyone, and thank you for listening to my latest video. I really enjoyed reading all of these stories, and I hope you enjoyed listening to them. This hour-long video will hopefully be the first of many, as I'm going to try to get a lot more longer content out. If you like my channel, like and subscribe, and I hope you have a great night.